Hello, it's time for Chapter 4 of Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman, published by Headline, and thank you to them for letting us do this. Hope you've been enjoying the chapter so far. If you have, please let me know, otherwise I will be stopping doing it. It's a bit abrupt, isn't it? Chapter 4. Mr. Croup and Mr. Vandermeer had set up their home in the cellar of a Victorian hospital, closed down 10 years earlier because of the National Health Service budget cutbacks. The property developers, who'd announced their intention of turning the hospital into an unparalleled block of luxury living accommodations, had faded away as soon as the hospital had been closed, and so it stood there year after year, grey, empty, unwanted, its windows boarded up, its doors padlocked shut. The roof was rotten and rain dripped through the empty hospital's interior, spreading damp and decay through the building. The hospital was ranged around a central well, which let in a certain amount of grey and unfriendly light. The basement world beneath the empty hospital wards comprised more than 100 tiny rooms, some of them empty, others containing abandoned hospital supplies. One room contained a squat, giant metal furnace, while the other room housed the blocked and waterless toilets and showers. Most of the basement floors were covered with a thin layer of oily rainwater which reflected the darkness and the decay back at the rotting ceilings. If you were to walk down the hospital steps as far down as you could go, through the abandoned shower rooms, past the staff toilets, past a room filled with broken glass where the ceiling had collapsed entirely, leaving it open to the stairwell above, you would reach a small, rusting iron staircase, from which the once white paint was peeling in long, damp, snaky strips. And if you went down the staircase and you traversed the marshy place at the bottom of the steps, you pushed your way through a half-decayed wooden door, you would find yourself in the sub-cellar, a huge room in which 120 years of hospital waste had accumulated, been abandoned and eventually forgotten. And it was here that Mr. Croup and Mr. Vandermeer had, for the present, made their home. The walls were damp, and water dripped from the ceiling. Odd things mouldered in corners. Some of them had once been alive. Mr. Croup and Mr. Vandermeer were killing time. Mr. Vandermeer had obtained from somewhere a centipede, a reddish-orange creature, almost 8 inches long, with vicious poisonous fangs, and was letting it run over his hands, watching as it twined between his fingers, vanished up one sleeve, and appeared a minute later out of the other. Mr. Croup was playing with razor blades. He'd found a whole box of 50-year-old razor blades wrapped in wax paper in a corner. He'd been trying to think of things to do with them. "If I might have your attention, Mr. Vandermeer," he said at length, "pipe your beady eyes on this." And Mr. Vandermeer held the centipede's head delicately between a huge thumb and a massive forefinger to stop it wriggling, and he looked at Mr. Croup. Mr. Croup put his left hand against the wall. Fingers spread. He took 5 razor blades in his right hand, took careful aim and threw them at the wall. Each blade stuck in to the wall between Mr. Croup's fingers. It was like a top knife thrower's act in miniature. Mr. Croup took his hand away, leaving the blades in the wall, one by darn it. Leaving the blades in the wall, outlining the place that his fingers had been, and he turned to his partner for approval. Mr. Vandermeer was unimpressed. "What's so clever about that, then?" he asked. "You didn't even hit one finger." Mr. Croup sighed. "I didn't." "Well," he said, "well, slip my gullet, you're right. How could I have been such a ninny?" He pulled the razor blades out of the wall one by one and dropped them onto the wooden table. "Why don't you show me how it should have been done?" Mr. Vandermeer nodded. He put his centipede back into its empty marmalade jar, and then he put his left hand against the wall. He raised his right hand. His knife, wicked and sharp and perfectly weighted, was in his right hand. He narrowed his eyes and he threw. The knife flew through the air like an extremely large and sharp knife flying through the air very fast indeed. It thudded into the damp plaster. blade first, the blade having first hit and penetrated the back of Mr. Vandermar's hand on its way. A telephone began to ring. Mr. Vandermar looked around, satisfied, with the knife still through his hand. "That's how it's done," he said. There was an old telephone in the corner of the room, an antique two-part telephone unused in the hospital since the 1920s, made of wood and bakelite. Mr. Croup picked up the earpiece, which was on a long cloth-wrapped cord, and spoke into the mouthpiece, which was attached to the base. "Croup and Vandermar," he said smoothly, "the old firm. Obstacles obliterated, nuisances eradicated, bothersome limbs removed, and tutelary dentistry." The person at the other end of the phone said something. Mr. Croup cringed. Mr. Vandermar tugged at his left hand. It was pinned hard to the wall. It wasn't coming free. "Oh, yes, sir. Oh, indeed. And might I say how your telephonic confabulation brightens up and cheers up our otherwise dreary and uneventful day?" Another pause. "Oh, of course I will stop toadying and crawling, delighted to, in honour. And what do we know? We know that—" An interruption. He picked his nose, reflectively, patiently. Then, No, we don't know where she is at this precise moment. But we don't have to. She'll be at the market tonight, and—" his mouth tightened, "we have no intention of violating their market truce, more of waiting till she has left the market and scrobbling her." He was silent then, and listened, nodding from time to time. Mr. Vandermar tried to pull the knife out of the wall with his free hand, but the knife was stuck fast. "That might be arranged, yes," said Mr. Croup into the mouthpiece. "I mean, it will be arranged, of course. Yeah, I realise that. And, sir, perhaps we could talk about—" But the caller had hung up. Mr. Croup stared at the earpiece for a moment, then put it back on its hook. "You think you're so damn clever," he whispered. And then he noticed Mr. Vandermar's predicament and said, "Stop that." And he leaned over and he pulled the knife out of the wall, out of the back of Mr. Vandermar's hand, put it down on the table. Mr. Vandermar shook his left hand and flexed the fingers, and then wiped fragments of damp plaster from his knife blade. "Who was that?" "Our employer," said Mr. Croup. "It seems the other one isn't going to work out. Not old enough. It's going to have to be the door female." "So we aren't allowed to kill her any more?" "That, Mr. Vandermar, would be about the short and the long of it, yes. Now it seems that little Miss Dore has announced she will be hiring a bodyguard at the market tonight." So Mr. Vandermar spat on the back of his hand where the knife had gone in, and on the palm of his hand where the knife had come out. He rubbed at the spit with a massive thumb. The flesh closed, knitted, and was whole again. Mr. Croup picked up his old coat, heavy, black and shiny with age, from the floor. He put it on. "So, Mr. Vandermar," he said, "shall we not also hire ourselves a bodyguard?" Mr. Vandermar slid his knife back into the holster in his sleeve. He put his coat on as well, and pushed his hands deep into the pockets, and was pleasantly surprised to find an almost untouched mouse in one pocket. Good. He was hungry. Then he pondered Mr. Croup's last statement with the intensity of an anatomist dissecting his one true love. And realising the flaw in his partner's logic, Mr. Vandermar said, "We don't need a bodyguard, Mr. Croup. We hurt people. We don't get hurt." Mr. Croup turned out the lights. "Oh, Mr. Vandermar," he said, enjoying the sound of the words as he enjoyed the sound of all words. "If you cut us, do we not bleed?" Mr. Vandermar pondered this for a moment in the dark. Then he said, perfectly accurately, "No." "A spy from the upworld," said the Lord Rat Speaker. "I should slit you from gullet to gizzard and tell fortunes with your guts." "Listen," said Richard, his back against the wall, with the glass dagger pressed against his Adam's apple. "I think you're making a bit of a mistake here. My name is Richard Mayhew. I can prove who I am. I've got my library cards, credit cards, things," he said desperately. At the opposite end of the hall, Richard noticed, with a dispassionate clarity that comes when a lunatic is about to slit your throat with a piece of broken glass, people were throwing themselves to the ground, bowing low and remaining on the floor. A small black shape was coming towards them along the ground. "I think a moment's reflection might prove that we're all being very silly," said Richard. He had no idea what the words meant, just that they were coming out of his mouth, and that as long as he was talking, he was not dead. "Now, why don't you put that away and excuse me, that's my bag." This last one to a thin, bedraggled girl in her late teens who had taken Richard's bag and was roughly tipping his possessions out onto the ground. The people in the hall continued to bow and to stay bowed as the small shape came closer. It reached the group of people around Richard, although not one of them noticed it. They were all looking at Richard. It was a rat, which looked up at Richard curiously. It had a bizarre and momentary impression that it winked one of its little black oil drop eyes at him, and then it chittered loudly. The man with the glass dagger threw himself onto his knees. So did the people around them. So too, after a moment's hesitation and a little more awkwardly, did the homeless man, the one they called Ilyasta. In a moment, Richard was the only one standing. The thin girl tugged at his elbow, and he too went down on one knee. Lord Ratspeaker bowed so low that his long hair brushed the ground, and he chittered back at the rat, wrinkling his nose, showing his teeth, squeaking and hissing, for all the world like an enormous rat himself. "Look, can anyone tell me?" muttered Richard. "Quiet," said the girl. The rat stepped, a little disdainfully it seemed, into the Lord Ratspeaker's grubby hand, and the man held it respectfully up in front of Richard's face. It waved its tail languidly as it inspected Richard's features. "This is Master Longtail of the Clan Grey," said the Lord Ratspeaker. "He says you look exceedingly familiar. He wants to know if he's met you before." Richard looked at the rat, and the rat looked at Richard. "I suppose it's possible," he admitted. "He says he was discharging an obligation to the Marquis de Carabas." Richard looked at the animal more closely. "It's that rat." "Oh, yes. Yeah, we have met. Actually, I threw the TV remote control at it." Some of the people standing around looked shocked. The thin girl actually squeaked. Richard hardly noticed them. At least something was familiar in this madness. "Hello, Ratty," he said. "Good to see you again. Do you know where Dora is?" "Ratty," said the girl in something between a squeak and a horrified swallow. She had a large, water-stained red button pinned to her ragged clothes, of the sort that comes attached to birthday cards. It said in yellow letters, "I am 11." Lord Ratspeaker waved his glass dagger admonishingly at Richard. "You must not address Master Longtail save through me," he said. The rat squeaked an order. The man's face fell. "In?" he said, looking at Richard disdainfully. "Look, I can't spare a soul. How about if I simply slice his throat and send him down to the sewer folk?" The rat chittered once more, decisively, and then leapt from the man's shoulder onto the ground and vanished into one of the many holes that lined the walls. The Lord Ratspeaker stood up. 100 eyes were fixed on him. He turned to the hall and looked at his subjects, crouched beside their greasy fires. "I don't know what you lot are all looking at," he shouted. "Who's turning the spitzer? You want the grub to burn? There's nothing to see. Go on, get away, the lot of you." Richard stood up nervously. His left leg had gone numb, and he rubbed life into it as it prickled with pins and needles. Lord Ratspeaker looked at Ilyasta. "He's got to be taken to the market. Master Longtail's orders." Ilyasta shook his head and spat on the ground. "Well, I'm not taking him," he said. "More than my life's worth, that journey. You Ratspeakers have always been good to me, but I can't go back there, you know that." The Lord Ratspeaker nodded. He put his dagger away in the furs of his robe. Then he smiled at Richard with yellow teeth. "You don't know how lucky you were just then," he said. "Yes, I do," said Richard. "I really do." "No," said the man, "you don't. You really don't." He shook his head, said to himself, marvelling, "Ratty." The Lord Ratspeaker took Ilyasta by the arm. The two of them walked a little way out of earshot and began to talk, darting looks back at Richard as they did so. The thin girl was gulping down one of Richard's bananas in what was, Richard reflected, the least erotic display of banana eating that he had ever seen. "You know, that was going to be my breakfast," said Richard. She looked up at him guiltily. "My name's Richard. What's yours?" The girl, who he realised had already managed to eat most of the fruit that Richard had brought with him, swallowed the last of the banana and hesitated. Then she half smiled and said something that sounded a lot like anaesthesia. "I was hungry," she said. "Well, so am I," he told her. She glanced at the little fires across the room. She looked back at Richard. She smiled. "Do you like cat?" "Yes," said Richard, "I quite like cats." Anaesthesia looked relieved. "Thigh," she said, "or breast?" The girl called Dor walked down the court, followed by the Marquis de Carabas. There were 100 other little courts and mews and alleys in London just like this one. Tiny spurs of old time, unchanged for 300 years. Even the smell of piss here was the same as it had been in Pepys' time, 300 years before. There was still an hour until dawn, but the sky was beginning to lighten, turning a stark leaden colour. Strands of mist hung like livid ghosts on the air. The door was roughly boarded up and covered with stained posters of forgotten bands and long-closed night spots. The two of them stopped in front of it, and the Marquis eyed it, all boards and nails and posters. He appeared unimpressed, but then unimpressed was his default state. "So, this is the entrance," he said. She nodded. "Well, one of them." He folded his arms. "Well, say open sesame, or whatever it is that you do." "I don't want to do this," she said. "I'm really not sure that we're doing the right thing." "Very well." He unfolded his arms. "I'll be seeing you then." And he turned on his heel. He began to walk back the way they'd come. Dor seized his arm. "You'd abandon me?" she asked. "Just like that?" He grinned without humour. "Certainly. I'm a very busy man. Things to do, things to see, people to do. Look, hold on." She let go of his sleeve, bit her lower lip. "The last time I was here," she trailed off. "The last time you were here, you found your family dead. Well, there you go. You don't have to explain it any more. If we aren't going in, then our business relationship is at an end." She looked up at him, her elfin face pale in the pre-dawn light. "And that's all?" "I could wish you the best of luck in your future career, but I'm rather afraid that you won't live long enough to have one." "You're a piece of work, aren't you?" He said nothing. She walked back towards the door. "Well," she said, "come on. I'll take us in." Dor put her left hand on the boarded-up door, and with her right hand she took the Marquis's huge brown hand. Her tiny fingers twined into his larger ones. She closed her eyes. Something whispered, shivered, and changed. The door collapsed into darkness. The memory was fresh. Only a few days old. Dor moved through the house without doors, calling, "I'm home," and "Hello." She slipped from the anteroom to the dining room to the library to the drawing room, and no one answered. She moved to another room. The swimming pool was an indoor Victorian structure, constructed of marble and cast iron. Her father had found it when he was younger, abandoned, about to be demolished. He'd woven it into the fabric of the house without doors. Perhaps in a world outside, in London above, the room had long since been destroyed and forgotten. Dor had no idea where any of the rooms of her house were physically. Her grandfather had constructed the house, taking a room from here and a room from there, all through London, discreet and doorless. Her father had added to it. She'd walked along the side of the old swimming pool, pleased to be home, puzzled by the absence of her family. And then she looked down. There was someone floating in the water, trailing twin clouds of blood behind him, one from the throat and one from the groin. It was her brother, Arch. His eyes were open wide and sightless. She realised that her mouth was open. She could hear herself screaming. "That hurt," said the Marquis. He rubbed his forehead hard, twisted his head around on his neck as if he was trying to ease a sudden painful crick. "Memories," she explained. "They're imprinted in the walls." He raised an eyebrow. "You could have warned me." "Ah," she said. "Right." They were in a huge white room. Every wall was covered with pictures. Every picture was a different room. The white room contained no doors, no openings of any kind. "Interesting decor," acknowledged the Marquis. "This is the entrance hall. We can go from here to any room in the house. They're all linked." "Where are the other rooms located?" She shook her head. "I don't know. Miles away, probably. They're scattered all over the underside." The Marquis had managed to cover the whole room in a series of impatient strides. Quite remarkable. An associative house, every room of which is located somewhere else. So imaginative. Your grandfather was a man of vision, Dor. "I never knew him." She swallowed and then continued, talking to herself as much as to him. "We should have been safe here. Nobody should have been able to hurt us. Only my family could move around it." "Well, let's hope that your father's journal gives us some clues," he said. "Where do we start looking?" Dor shrugged. "You're certain he kept a journal?" he pressed. She nodded. "He used to go into his study and private the links until he'd finished dictating." "We'll start in the study then." "But I looked there. I did. I looked there. When I was cleaning up the body," and she began to cry in a low raging sob that sounded like they were being tugged from inside her. There, said the Marquis de Carabas awkwardly, patting her shoulder, and he added, for good measure, "There." He did not comfort well. Dor's odd-coloured eyes were filled with tears. Can you just give me a sec? I'll be fine." He nodded and walked to the far end of the room. When he looked back, she was still standing there on her own, silhouetted in the white entrance chamber, filled with pictures of rooms, and she was hugging herself and shuddering and crying like a little girl. Richard was still upset about the loss of his bag. The Lord Rat Speaker remained unmoved. He stated boldly that the rat, Master Longtail, had said nothing at all about returning Richard's things, just that he was to be taken to the market. Then he told Anastasia that she was taking the Upworlder to the market, and yes, that was an order, and to stop snivelling, and to get a move on. And he told Richard that if he, Lord Rat Speaker, ever saw him again, then he, Richard, would be in a lot of trouble. He reiterated that Richard did not know how lucky he was, and ignoring Richard's request that he return Richard's stuff, or at least the wallet, he led them to the door, and he locked it behind them. Richard and Anastasia walked into the darkness side by side. She carried an improvised lamp made of a candle, a tin, some wire, and a wide-mouthed glass lemonade bottle. Richard was surprised how quickly his eyes became used to the near darkness. They seemed to be walking through a succession of underground vaults and storage cellars. Sometimes he thought he could see movement in far corners of the vaults, but whether human or rat or something else altogether, it was always gone by the time they reached the place it had been. When he tried to talk to Anastasia about the movements, she hissed him to silence. He felt a cold draught on his face. The rat girl squatted without warning, put down her candle lamp and tugged and pulled hard at a metal grill set in the wall. It opened suddenly, sending her sprawling. She motioned Richard to go through. He crouched, edged through the hole in the wall, and after about a foot the floor stopped completely. "Excuse me," whispered Richard. "There's a hole here." "It's not a big drop," she told him. "Go on." She shut the grill behind her. She was now uncomfortably close to Richard. "Here," she said. She gave him the handle of her little lamp to hold and clambered down into the darkness. "There," she said. "That wasn't bad, was it?" Her face was a few feet below Richard's dangling feet. "Here, pass me the lamp." He lowered it down to her. She had to jump to take it from him. "Now," she whispered. "Come on." He edged nervously forward and climbed over the edge and hung for a moment and let go. He landed on his hands and feet in soft wet mud. He wiped the mud off his hands onto his jumper. A few feet forward, Anastasia was opening another door. They went through it. She pulled it behind her. "We can talk now," she said. "Not loud, but we can, if you want to." "Oh, thanks," said Richard. He couldn't think of anything to say. "So, you're a rat, are you?" he said. She giggled like a Japanese girl, covering her face with her hand as she laughed. Then she shook her head. She said, "Oh, I should be so lucky. I wish. No, I'm a rat speaker. We talk to rats." "What, just chat to them?" "Oh, no, we do stuff for them. I mean," and the tone of her voice implied that this was something that might never have occurred to Richard, unassisted. "There are some things that rats cannot do. You know, I mean, not having fingers and thumbs and things. Hang on. She pressed him against the wall suddenly and clamped a filthy hand over his mouth. Then she blew out the candle. Nothing happened. Then he heard distant voices. They waited in the darkness and the cold. Richard shivered. People walked past them, talking in low tones. When all sounds had died away, Anastasia took her hand from Richard's mouth, relit the candle, and they walked on. Who were they? Asked Richard. She shrugged. Don't matter, she said. Then what makes you think they wouldn't have been pleased to see us? She looked at him rather sadly, like a mother trying to explain to an infant that, yes, this flame was hot too. All flames were hot. Trust her, please. Come on, she said. I know a shortcut. We can nip through London above for a bit. And they went up some stone steps, and the girl pushed open a door, and they stepped through, and the door closed shut behind them. Richard looked around, puzzled. They were standing on the embankment, that miles-long walkway that the Victorians had built along the north shore of the Thames, covering the drainage system and the newly created district line of the Underground, and replacing the stinking mudflats that had festered along the banks of the Thames for the previous 500 years. It was still night, or perhaps it was night once more. He was unsure how long they'd been walking through the underplaces in the dark. There was no moon, but the night sky was a riot of crisp and glittering autumn stars. There were streetlights too, and lights on buildings and on bridges which looked like earthbound stars, and they glimmered, repeated, as they were reflected with the city in the night water of the Thames. It's fairyland, thought Richard. Anastasia blew out her candle, and Richard said, Are you sure this is the right way? Yes, she said, pretty sure. They were approaching a wooden bench, and the moment he set eyes on it, it seemed Richard that the bench was one of the most desirable objects he'd ever seen. Can we sit down? He said. Just for a minute. She shrugged. They sat down at opposite ends of the bench. On Friday, said Richard, I was with one of the finest investment analysts in London. What's an investment thing? It was my job. She nodded, satisfied. Right? And? Just reminding myself, really. Yesterday, it was like I didn't exist anymore to anybody up here. That's 'cause you don't, explained Anastasia. A late-night couple who'd been slowly walking along the embankment towards them, holding hands, sat down in the middle of the bench between Richard and Anastasia and commenced to kiss each other passionately. Excuse me, said Richard to them. The man had his hand inside the woman's jumper. He was moving it around enthusiastically, a lone traveller, discovering an unexplored continent. I want my life back, Richard told the couple. I love you, said the man to the woman. But your wife, she said, licking the side of his face. Fuck her, said the man. Don't want to fuck her, said the woman, and giggled drunkenly. I want to fuck you. And she put a hand on his crotch and giggled some more. Come on, said Richard to Anastasia, feeling the bench had started to become a less desirable neighbourhood. And they got up and walked away. Anastasia peered back, curiously, at the couple on the bench who were gradually becoming more horizontal. Richard said nothing. Something wrong? Said Anastasia. Only everything, said Richard. Have you always lived down there? No, I was born up here, she hesitated. You don't want to hear about me? Richard realised, almost surprised, that he really did. I do, really. She fingered the rough quartz beads and hung in a necklace around her neck, and she swallowed. There was me and Mum and the twins, she said, and then she stopped talking, her mouth clamped shut. Go on, said Richard. It's all right, really, it is. Honest. The girl nodded. She took a deep breath. She began to talk without looking at him as she talked, her eyes fixed on the ground ahead of her. Well, Mum had me and my sisters, but she got a bit funny in the head. One day I got home from school and she was crying, and she didn't have no clothes on, and she was breaking stuff, plates and stuff, but she never hurt us, she never did. The lady from social services come and she took the twins away, and I had to go and stay with my aunt, and she was living with this bloke. I didn't like him. And when she was out the house, the girl paused. She was quiet for so long that Richard wondered if she'd finished. And then she began once more. Anyway, he used to hurt me, and do other stuff. In the end, I told my aunt, and she started hitting me, said I was lying, said she'd have the police on me, but I wasn't lying, so I ran away. It was my birthday. They had reached the Albert Bridge, a kitsch monument spanning the Thames, joining Battersea to the south with the Chelsea end of the embankment. A fairy tale bridge hung with thousands of tiny white lights. I didn't have anywhere to go, and it was so cold, said Anastasia, and she stopped again. I slept on the streets. I'd sleep in the day when it was a little bit warmer, and then walk around at night, just keep moving. I was only 11, stealing bread and milk off people's doorsteps to eat. Hated doing that, but I started hanging around the street markets, taking the rotten apples and oranges and things people throw away. Then I got really sick. I was living under a flyover in Notting Hill. When I come to, I was in London below. The rats had found me. Have you ever tried to return to all this? He asked, gesturing. Quiet, warm, inhabited houses and late-night cars. The real world. She shook her head. All fire burns, little baby. You'll learn. You can't. It's one or the other. Nobody gets both. I'm sorry, said Dor, hesitantly. Her eyes were red, and she looked as if she'd been vigorously blowing her nose and scrubbing her tears from her eyes and cheeks. The Marquis, who'd been amusing himself, playing a game of knuckle bones with some old coins and bones he kept in one of the many pockets in his coat, looked up at her coldly. Indeed? She bit her lower lip. No, not really. I'm not sorry. I've been running and hiding and running so hard that this was the first chance I really had to... She stopped. The Marquis swept up the coins and the bones and returned them to their pocket. After you, he said, and he followed her back to the wall of pictures. She put one hand on the painting of her father's study and took the Marquis's large black hand in the other, and reality twisted. They were in the conservatory, watering the plants. First Portia would water a plant, directing the flow of water towards the soil at the base of the plant, avoiding the leaves and the blossoms. Water the shoes, she said to her youngest daughter, not the clothes. Ingress had her own little watering can. She was so proud of it. It was just like her mother's, made of steel and painted bright green. As her mother finished with a plant, Ingress would water it with her tiny watering can. On the shoes, she told her mother. She began laughing then, spontaneous little girl laughter, and her mother laughed too, until foxy Mr. Croup pulled her hair back hard and sudden and cut her white throat from ear to ear. Hello, Daddy, said Dor, quietly. She touched the bust of her father with her fingers, stroking the side of his face. A thin, ascetic man, almost bald. Caesar as Prospero, thought the Marquis de Carabas. He felt a little sick. That last image had hurt. Still, he was in Lord Portico's study, and that was a first. The Marquis took in the room, eyes sliding from detail to detail. The stuffed crocodile hanging from the ceiling, the leather-bound books, an astrolabe, convex and concave mirrors, odd scientific instruments. There were maps on the walls of lands and cities that de Carabas had never heard of. A desk covered in handwritten correspondence. The white wall behind the desk was marred by a reddish-brown stain. There was a small portrait of Dor's family on the desk. The Marquis stared at it. Your mother and your sister and your father and your brother, all dead. How did you escape? He asked. She lowered her head. I was lucky. I'd gone off exploring for a few days. Did you know there were still some Roman soldiers camped out by the Kilburn River? The Marquis had not known this, which irritated him. How many? She shrugged. A few dozen. They were deserters from the 19th Legion, I think. My Latin's a bit patchy. Anyway, when I got back here... She paused and swallowed, her opal-coloured eyes brimming with tears. Pull yourself together, said the Marquis shortly. We need your father's journal. We have to find out who did this. She frowned at him. We know who did this. It was Croup and Vandemar. He opened a hand and wiggled his fingers as he spoke. Their arms, hands, fingers. There's a head that ordered it, and that wants you dead too. Those two don't come cheap. He looked around the cluttered office. His journal? said the Marquis. "It's not here," she said. "I told you, I looked. I was under the misapprehension that your family was skilled in locating doors, both obvious and otherwise." She glowered at him. Then she closed her eyes and put her finger and thumb on each side of the bridge of her nose. Meanwhile, the Marquis examined the objects on Lord Portico's desk: an inkwell, a chess piece, a bone die, a gold pocket watch, several quill feathers, and... interesting. It was a small statue of a boar, or a crouching bear, or perhaps a bull. It was hard to tell. It was the size of a large chess piece. It had been carved roughly out of black obsidian. It reminded him of something, but of what he could not say. He picked it up casually, turned it over, curled his fingers around it. Dor lowered her hand from her face. She looked puzzled and confused. "What's the matter?" he asked. "It is here," she said simply. She began to walk through the study, head turning first to one side and then to the other. The Marquis slipped the carving discreetly into an inside pocket. Dor stood before a high cabinet. "There," she said. She reached out her hand. There was a click, and a small panel in the side of the cabinet swung open. Dor reached into the darkness and removed something roughly the size and shape of a small cannonball. She passed it to the Marquis. It was a sphere, constructed of old brass and polished wood, inset with polished copper and glass lenses. He took it from her. "This is it?" She nodded. "Well done." She looked grave. "I don't know how I could have missed it before." "You were upset," said the Marquis. "I was certain it would be here, and I am so rarely wrong. Now," he held the little wooden globe up. The light caught the polished glass and glinted from the brass and copper fittings. It galled him to admit ignorance about anything, but he said it anyway. "How does this work?" Anastasia had led Richard into a small park on the south side of a bridge, then down some stone steps set beside a wall. She relit her candle in a bottle, and then she opened a workman's door and closed it behind them. They went down some steps with the darkness all around them. "There's a girl named Dor," said Richard. "She's a bit younger than you. Do you know her?" "The Lady Dor? I know who she is." "So which, barony is she part of?" "No barony. She is of the House of Arch. Her family used to be very important." "Used to be? Why did they stop? Somebody killed them." "Yes." He remembered the Marquis saying something about that now. A rat ran across their path. Anastasia stooped on the steps and performed a deep courtesy. The rat paused. "Sire," she said to the rat. "Hi," said Richard. The rat looked at them for a heartbeat, and then it darted off down the steps. "So," said Richard, "what is a floating market?" "It's very big," she said, "but rat speakers hardly ever need to go to the market. To tell the truth—" She hesitated. "No, you'll laugh at me." "I won't," said Richard, honestly. "Well," said the thin girl, "I'm a little scared." "Scared of the market?" They'd reached the bottom of the steps. Anastasia hesitated and then turned left. "Oh, no, there's a truce in the market. If anyone hurt anyone there, the whole of London below would be on them like a ton of sewage." "So what are you scared of?" "Getting there. They hold it in a different place each time. It moves around, and to get to the place it'll be tonight—" She fingered the quartz beads around her neck nervously. "We'll have to go through a really nasty neighbourhood." She did sound scared. Richard suppressed the urge to put an arm around her. "Where would that be?" he asked. She turned to him, pushed the hair out of her eyes. She told him. "Knightsbridge," repeated Richard, and he began to chuckle gently. The girl turned away. "See, I said you'd laugh." The deep tunnels had been dug in the early days of the Second World War. Troops had been quartered there in their thousands, their waste needing to be pumped up by compressed air to the level of the sewers far above. Both sides of the tunnels had been lined with metal bunk beds for the troops to sleep on. There had been plans to assimilate the tunnels into a high-speed extension to the underground system, but these plans came to nothing, and when the war ended, the bunk beds had stayed in the tunnels, and on their wire bases cardboard boxes were stored. each box filled with letters and files and papers. Secrets of the dullest kind, stored down deep to be forgotten. Economies had closed the deep tunnels completely in the early 1990s. The boxes of secrets were removed to be scanned and stored on computers or to be shredded or burned. Varney made his home in the deepest of the deep tunnels, far beneath Camden Town Tube. He'd piled abandoned metal bunk beds in front of the only entrance, and then he'd decorated. Varney liked weapons. He made his own out of whatever he could find or take or steal. Parts of cars, rescued bits of machinery which he turned into hooks, shivs, crossbows and arbalests, small mangonels and trebuchets for breaking walls, and cudgels and glaives and knob carries. They hung on the wall of the deep tunnel or sat in corners looking unfriendly. Varney looked like a bull might look if the bull were to be shaved, dehorned, covered in tattoos, and had suffered from complete dental breakdown. Also, he snored. The oil lamp next to his head was turned down low. Varney slept on a pile of rags, snoring and snuffling, with the hilt of a homemade two-bladed sword on the ground beside his hand. A hand turned up the oil lamp. Varney had the two-bladed sword in his hand, was on his feet almost before his eyes were open. He blinked, stared around him. There was no one there. Nothing had disturbed the pile of bunk beds blocking the door. He began to lower the sword. A voice said, "Psst." "Huh?" said Varney. "Surprise," said Mr. Croup, stepping into the light. Varney took a step back. A mistake. There was a knife at his temple, the point of the blade next to his eye. "Further movements are not recommended," said Mr. Croup helpfully. "Mr. Vandermeer might have a little accident with his old toad sticker. Most accidents do occur in the home. Is that not true, Mr. Vandermeer?" "I don't trust statistics," said Mr. Vandermeer's blank voice. A gloved hand reached down from behind Varney and crushed his sword and dropped the twisted thing on the floor. "How are you, Varney?" asked Mr. Croup. "Well, we trust. Yes, in fine form, fetlock and fettle for the market tonight. Do you know who we are?" Varney did the nearest thing that he could to a nod that didn't actually involve any muscles. He knew who Croup and Vandermeer were. His eyes were searching the walls. Yes, there. The Morning Star, a spiked wooden ball, studded with nails, on a chain, in the far corner of the room. "There is talk that a certain young lady will be auditioning for bodyguards this evening. Have you thought of trying out for the task?" Mr. Croup picked at his tombstone teeth. "Enunciate clearly." Mr. Varney picked up the Morning Star with his mind. It was his knack. Gentle now. Slowly, he edged it off the hook and pulled it up towards the top of the tunnel arch. With his mouth, he said, "Varney's the best bravo and guard in the underside. They say I'm the best since Hunter's Day." Varney mentally positioned the Morning Star in the shadows above and behind Mr. Croup's head. He would crush Croup's skull first, then he'd take Vandermeer. The Morning Star plunged towards Mr. Croup's head. Varney flung himself down away from the knife blade at his eye. Mr. Croup did not look up. He did not turn. He simply moved his head obscenely fast, and the Morning Star crashed past him into the floor, where it threw up chips of brick and concrete. Mr. Vandermeer picked Varney up with one hand. "Hurt him?" he asked his partner. Mr. Croup shook his head. "Not yet." To Varney he said, "Not bad. So, best bravo and guard, we want you to get yourself to the market tonight. We want you to do whatever you have to do to become that certain young lady's personal bodyguard. Then when you get the job, one thing you don't forget. You may guard her from the rest of the world, but when we want her, we take her. Got it?" Mr. Varney rang his tongue over the wreck of his teeth. "Are you bribing me?" he asked. Mr. Vandermeer had picked up the Morning Star. He was pulling the chain apart with his free hand, link by link, and dropping the little bits of twisted metal on the floor. "Chink." "No," said Mr. Vandermeer. "Chink, we're intimidating you." "Chink, And if you don't do what Mr. Croup says, we're, chink, hurting you, chink, very badly before we're, chink, killing you, even badlier. Oh, said Varney, then I'm working for you, aren't I? Yes, you are, said Mr. Croup. I'm afraid we don't have any redeeming features. That doesn't bother me, said Varney. Good, said Mr. Croup. Welcome aboard. It was a large but elegant mechanism, built of polished walnut and oak, of brass and glass and copper and mirrors and carved and inlaid ivory, of quartz prisms and brass gears and springs and cogs. The whole thing was rather larger than a widescreen television, although the actual screen itself was no more than 6 inches across. A magnifying lens placed across it increased the size of the picture. There was a large brass horn, rather like an ear trumpet, coming out of the side, the kind that you'd find on an antique gramophone. The whole mechanism looked rather like a combined television and video player might look if it had been invented and built 300 years ago by Sir Isaac Walton, which was more or less exactly what it was. Watch, said Dor. She placed the wooden ball onto the platform. Lights shone through the machine and into the ball. It began to spin around and around. A patrician face appeared on the small screen, vividly coloured. Slightly at a time, a voice came from the horn, crackling in mid-speech. The two cities should be so near, said the voice, and yet in all things so far, the possessors above us, and the dispossessed, we who live below and between, who live in the cracks. Dor stared at the screen, her face unreadable. Still, said her father, I am of the opinion that what cripples us, who inhabit the underside, is our petty factionalism. The system of baronies and fiefdoms is both divisive and foolish. The Lord Portico was wearing a threadbare old smoking jacket and a skull-cap. His voice seemed to be coming to them across the centuries, not days or weeks. He coughed. I am not alone in this belief. There are those who wish to see things the way they are. There are others who wish the situation to worsen. There are those... Could you speed it up a bit? Asked the Marquis. Find the last entry. Dor nodded. She touched an ivory lever at the side. The image ghosted, fragmented and reformed. And now Portico wore a long coat. His skull cap was gone. There was a scarlet gash down the side of his head. He was no longer sitting at his desk. He was talking urgently and quietly. I do not know who will see this, who will find this, but whoever you are, please take this to my daughter, the Lady Dor, if she lives. A static burst wiped across the picture, and then the sound. Then, Dor, girl, this is bad. I don't know how long I've got before they find this room. I think my poor Portia and your brother and sister are dead. The sound and picture quality began to degrade. The Marquis glanced at the door. Her face was wet. Tears were brimming from her eyes and glistening down her cheeks. She seemed unaware that she was crying, made no attempt to wipe away the tears. She just stared at her father's image and listened to his words. Crackle, wipe, crackle. Listen to me, girl, said her dead father's voice. Go to Islington. You can trust Islington. You must believe in Islington. He ghosted. Blood had dripped from his forehead into his eyes, and he wiped it off. Dor, avenge us. Avenge your family. A loud bang came from the gramophone horn. Portico turned his head to look off-screen, puzzled and nervous. What? He said, and he stepped out of frame. For a moment the picture remained unchanged. The desk, the blank white wall behind it. Then an arc of vivid blood splashed across the wall. Dor flicked a lever on the side, blanking the screen. She turned away. Here, said the Marquis, and he passed her a handkerchief. Thanks. She wiped her face and blew her nose vigorously. Then she stared into space. Eventually she said, Islington. I've never had any dealings with Islington, said the Marquis. I thought it was just a legend, she said. Not at all. He reached across the desk and picked up the gold pocket watch, thumbed it open. Nice workmanship, he observed. She nodded. It was my father's. He closed the cover with a click. Time to go to market. It starts soon. Mr. Time is not our friend. She blew her nose once more, put her hands deep into the pockets of her leather jacket. Then she turned to him, elfin face frowning, odd-coloured eyes bright. Do you honestly think we can find a bodyguard who could deal with Croup and Vandermeer? The Marquis flashed his white teeth at her. There's been no one since Hunter who'd even be in with a chance. No, I'll settle for someone who'd give you the time you might need to get away. He fastened the fob of the watch chain to his waistcoat. He slid the watch into his vest pocket. What are you doing? Asked Dora. That's my father's watch. He's not using it any more, is he? He adjusted the golden chain. There. It looks rather elegant. He watched the emotions flicker across her face. Grief, anger, finally resignation. We'd better go, was all she said. The bridge isn't very far now, said Anastasia. Richard hoped that was true. They were on to their third candle. He was astonished that they were still under London. He was half convinced they must have walked most of the way to Wales. I'm really scared, she continued. I've never crossed a bridge before. I thought you said you'd been to this market already, he asked, mystified. It's the floating market, silly. I told you already. It moves. Different places. Last one I went to was held in that big clock tower. Big someone. And the next was Big Ben? Maybe. We were inside where all the big wheels went around. That's where I got this. She held up her necklace. The candlelight glimmered yellow off the shiny quartz. She smiled, just like a child. Do you like it? She asked. It's great. Was it expensive? I swapped some stuff for it. That's how things work down here. We swap stuff. Then they turned a corner and saw the bridge. It could have been one of the bridges over the Thames. 500 years ago, thought Richard. A huge stone bridge spanning out over a vast black chasm into the night. But there was no sky above it, no water below. It rose into darkness. Richard wondered who'd built it and when. He wondered how something like this could exist beneath the city of London without anybody knowing. He felt a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. He was, he realised, deeply, pathetically scared of the bridge itself. Do we have to go across it? He asked. Can't we get to the market some other way? They paused at the base of the bridge. Anastasia shook her head. We can get to the place it's in, she said, but the market wouldn't be there. Hmm? But that's ridiculous. I mean, something's either there or it's not, isn't it? I mean, isn't it? She shook her head. There was a buzz of voices from behind him. Someone pushed Richard to the ground. He looked up. A huge man, crudely tattooed, dressed in improvised rubber and leather clothes that looked like they'd been cut out from the insides of cars, stared back down at him dispassionately. Behind the huge man were a dozen others, male and female, people who looked like they were on their way to a particularly low-rent costume party. Somebody, said Varney, who was not in a good mood, was in my way. Somebody ought to watch where he's going. Once, as a small boy walking home from school, Richard had encountered a rat in a ditch by the side of the road. When the rat saw Richard, it had reared up onto its hind legs and hissed and jumped, terrifying Richard. So he backed away, marvelling that something so small had been so willing to fight something so much larger than itself. Now Anastasia stepped between Richard and Varney. She was less than half his size, but she glared at the big man and bared her teeth, and she hissed like an angry rat at bay. Varney took a step backwards. Varney spat at Richard's shoes. Then he turned away, and taking the knot of people with him, he walked across the bridge and into the dark. "Are you all right?" asked Anastasia, helping Richard back to his feet. "I'm fine," he said. "That was really brave of you." She looked down shyly. "I'm not really brave," she said. "I'm still scared of the bridge. Even that lot was scared. That's why they all went over together. Safety in numbers, big bullies." "If you are crossing the bridge, I will go with you," said a female voice, as rich as cream and honey coming from behind them. Richard was never able to place her accent. At one time he thought she might be Canadian or American, and later he suspected she might have been African or Australian or even Indian. He was never able to tell. She was a tall woman, with long tawny hair and skin the colour of burnt caramel. She wore dappled leather clothes mottled in shades of grey and brown. She had a battered leather duffel bag over her shoulder. She was carrying a staff and had a knife at her belt, and an electric torch strapped to her wrist. She was also, without question, the most beautiful woman that Richard had ever seen. "Safety in numbers. You're welcome to come with us," he said, after a moment's hesitation. "My name's Richard Mayhew. This is Anastasia. She's the one who knows what she's doing," the rat girl preened. The leather woman looked him up and looked him down. "You're from London above," she told him. "Yes." "Travelling with a rat speaker. My word." "I'm his guardian," said Anastasia truculently. "Who are you? Who do you owe fealty to?" The woman smiled. "I know no man, fealty, rat girl. Have either of you crossed the night bridge before? Anastasia shook her head. Well, said the woman, isn't this going to be fun? They walked towards the bridge. Anastasia handed Richard her candle lamp. Here, she said. Thanks. Richard looked at the woman in leather. Is there anything really to be scared of? Only the night on the bridge, she said. The kind in armour? The kind that comes when day is over. Anastasia's hand sought Richard's. He held it tightly, her tiny hand in his. She smiled at him, squeezed his hand, and then they set foot on the knight's bridge. Richard began to understand darkness. Darkness as something solid and real, so much more than a simple absence of light. He felt it touch his skin, questing and moving, exploring, gliding through his mind. It slipped into his lungs, behind his eyes, and into his mouth. With each step they took, the light of the candle became dimmer. He realised that the same thing was happening to the leather woman's torch. It felt not so much as if the lights were being turned down, but as if the darkness were being turned up. Richard blinked. He opened his eyes on nothing but darkness, complete and utter. Sounds. A rustling, a squirming. Richard blinked, blinded by the night. The sounds were nastier, hungrier. Richard imagined he could hear voices, a horde of huge misshapen trolls beneath the bridge. Something slithered past them in the dark. What's that? Squeaked Anastasia. Her hand was shaking in his. Hush, whispered the woman. Don't attract its attention. What's happening? Whispered Richard. Darkness is happening, said the leather woman very quietly. Night is happening. All the nightmares that have come out when the sun goes down since the cave times, when we huddled together in fear for safety and warmth, are happening. Now, she told them, now is the time to be afraid of the dark. Richard knew that something was about to creep over his face. He closed his eyes. It made no difference to what he saw or felt. The night was complete. It was then that the hallucinations started. He saw a figure falling towards him through the night, burning in its wings and its hair on fire. He threw up his hands. There was nothing there. Jessica looked at him with contempt in her eyes. He wanted to shout to her, to tell her he was sorry. Place one foot after another. He was a small child walking home from school at night down the one road with no street lights. No matter how many times he did it, it never got easier, never got any better. He was deep in the sewers, lost in a labyrinth. The beast was waiting for him. He could hear a slow drip of water. He knew the beast was waiting. He gripped his spear, then a rumbling bellow deep in its throat from behind him. He turned slowly, agonizingly slowly. It charged at him through the dark, and it charged, and he died, and he kept walking. And slowly, agonizingly slowly, it charged at him over and over through the dark. There was a sputter and a flare so bright it hurt, making Richard squint and stagger. It was the candle flame in its lemonade bottle holder. He'd never known how brightly a single flame could burn. He held it, gasping and gulping and shaking with relief. His heart was pounding and shuddering in his chest. We would appear to have crossed successfully, said the leather woman. Richard's heart was pounding in his chest so hard that for a few moments he was unable to talk. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to calm down. They were in a large anteroom, exactly like the one on the other side. In fact, Richard had the strange feeling that it was the same room they had just left. Yet the shadows were deeper. There were after-images floating before Richard's eyes, like those one saw after a camera flash. I suppose, Richard said haltingly, we weren't in any real danger. It was like a haunted house. A few noises in the dark, and your imagination does the rest. There wasn't anything to be scared of, was there? The woman looked at him almost pityingly. Richard realised there was nobody holding his hand. Anastasia? From the darkness, at the crown of the bridge, there came a gentle noise like a rustle or sigh. A handful of irregular quartz beads pattered down the curve of the bridge towards them. Richard picked one up. It was from the rat girl's necklace. We'd better go back. The woman raised her torch, shone it across the bridge. Richard could see all the way across the bridge. It was deserted. Where is she? He asked. Gone, the woman said, flatly. The darkness took her. "We've got to do something," said Richard urgently. "Such as?" He opened his mouth, but at the same time he found no words. He closed it again. He fingered the lump of quartz, looked at the others on the ground. "She's gone," said the woman. "The bridge takes its toll. Be grateful it didn't take you too. Now, if you're going to the market, it's through here, up this way." She gestured towards a narrow passageway that rose up into the dimness in front of them, barely illuminated by the beam of her torch. Richard did not move. He felt numb. He found it hard to believe that the rat girl was gone, lost, or stolen, or strayed, and harder to believe that the leather woman was able to carry on as if nothing at all out of the ordinary had happened, as if this were utterly usual. Anesthesia could not be dead. He completed the thought. She could not be dead, because if she was, then that was his fault. She'd not asked to go with him. He held the quartz bead so tightly it hurt his hand, thinking of the pride with which she'd shown it to him, of how fond he'd become of her in the handful of hours that he'd known her. "Are you coming?" Richard stood there in the darkness for a few pounding heartbeats. Then he placed the quartz bead gently into the pocket of his jeans, and he followed the woman, who was still some paces ahead of him. As he followed her, he realised he still did not know her name. It's the end of chapter 4. Neil Gaiman, Neverwhere. Headline: "Thank you for listening." Special hello to Marianne, who I think is possibly the only person who is listening. So hope you're very well. Speak soon, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy the rest of your day.